Circle of Hope Network, doing life and being church together.
So here we're going to broaden it a bit from just the issue of suicide to the larger issue of ministry with trauma, and more importantly, this issue of what it does to us and how do we take care of ourselves. So here's the thing that they don't really tell you about in seminary. When that phone rings in the middle of the night and we have to rush out like the Caped Crusader to fight darkness. Especially when I was a Lutheran pastor and wore black, I really resonated with this guy here. I never had the car though. And as a chaplain, you know, I kind of always imagined, like this chaplain in Saving Private Ryan, that that's the kind of crisis ministry I was going to be about. And instead, the kind of crises that I dealt with were like this. Memorial Day, 1989. I went to the Lutheran Seminary at Gettysburg, and we went to the Memorial Day ceremony at Gettysburg National Cemetery. That's the one that Lincoln dedicated when he gave his Gettysburg address. And we walked up, and my wife was 7 months pregnant, and about 3 o'clock in the morning, she wakes up, she says, "I think my water's broke." And I resort to battle mode, and I'm calling the doctors, I'm taking her in, and come to find out it was not her water broke, but rather she had a placental abruption. And the placenta had been pulling away, and so a nice big pool of blood there, and so when it finally detached, all that blood is what I found in our home when I got home the next day after this. So we got her into the hospital and did an emergency C-section, and my son was born 2 months premature. 2 days before my first call sermon to be called to my first church after graduating from seminary 10 days before. And it started my first two-church district with my son in an intensive care unit for the first 2 months. Wow, I lasted 11 months in that church. Then my daughter, a couple of years later, 2 months before the due date, my wife's noticed that her pants were awful wet. The membranes ruptured. She lost almost all the amniotic fluid. So on bed rest for a month, another C-section. And then my daughter's about 18 months, and we know she was falling down a lot and having problems with walking, and our pediatrician didn't seem to think there was a problem. We were in Montpelier, Vermont, and I went ahead and went on up to some Army training up at CFB Gagetown. And while she was there, she went down to her parents' house in southern Vermont and went to the doctor there, and she says, "Oh, she has hip dysplasia. Was born with a dislocated hip that our pediatrician never caught." So in and out of the Shriners Hospital, in and out of traction. Imagine an 18-month-old in traction for a month with the pulleys and the weights, and then in and out of body casts that went from armpits to her toes. Yeah, that's the kinds of experiences that I had as a young pastor. Not dealing with other people's trauma, dealing with my own and my family's. As a chaplain, I've had to be in that position too, with another officer telling people about bad news. Both the casualty notifications I did, it was telling parents that their child committed suicide. One was a young woman, about 35, E7, just gave birth to her first baby, just got promoted to warrant officer, and postpartum depression, she killed herself. Santa Fe High School a year ago, a student goes into the art room and starts shooting up his friends and teachers. Every CISM instructor and facilitator within 1,000 miles was called in, FBI, all kinds of folks. in the aftermath. And then a week after, Tillman Fertitta, the owner of the Houston Rockets, says, hey, we're doing this playoff game against the Golden State Warriors. Let's treat all the seniors of that class to free tickets to the playoff game. And the school administrator said, sure, why not? So we got 10 school buses, and one of the folks from the Galveston County Mental Health Agency puts out the all-call. I need every friend of mine that's done critical incident stress management training to get in touch with me. And she had one of us on each of the buses. I got the short bus with the soccer team. And so we rode up there. They shut down Interstate 45, about 50 police cars as an escort, a helicopter up above. And of course, this is all being on live network TV because it's a playoff game. And they pushed us all into one section so the spotlight could shine on us all. And then the school choir sang the national anthem. And but for the kids, it was cathartic. They had not seen each other since the shooting. There had been no school afterwards. It was towards the last week of school. And then on the way back, they started talking. Giving each other advice on how to handle the media. One kid telling me how his parents had moved there out of the barrio in Houston because he'd had 3 of his friends killed in gang-related fighting, and they moved to a small town because they thought it was safe. That was on a Thursday. Then they called us up, said, hey, come back on Monday. It's the first day of school. Afterwards, the seniors were coming in just to get their stuff and go out, and they had us then meet with what's called a crisis management brief in the CISM language, just to have the parents and the kids that were actually in the room. So a lot of the kids there had bandages on their necks, on their arms, on their legs, walking on crutches. Just to say, hey, these are some of the things that you might be experiencing. These are some of the feelings that you're going to have. We've got counselors if you want somebody to talk to. We've got other community resources that are going to be here going forward. And the rest of that day, I had some conversations, and they especially wanted us some military veterans. And one mom saying, hey, my kid is going around checking all the lights, checking all the locks on the doors. Is this normal? Yeah, it is. So a lot of what you're doing at that point is just normalizing, letting them know, yeah, this is okay. You're feeling this, you're feeling that, your body's reacting this way. Yeah, that's okay. Talking to some of the teachers that save students' lives. That was, yeah, and we just had the anniversary last week. What is trauma? How would you define it?
Unexpected stress added to your life.
Unexpected stress added to your life?
And I mean by stress, I mean stressful situations.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
Not stress that, oh no, I'm in traffic. It's
Right.
an impacting incident.
An impacting incident. Okay. What else?
Significant injury.
Significant injury. What's the difference between a trauma room and an ER?
No.
Trauma is an ongoing. ER seems to be more, you have to respond quicker.
No, ER could be headaches, heart attacks. Trauma is bodily injury. So trauma room is the shooting, the stabbing, the car wreck, where first thing you do is strip that person naked, have them trauma naked on the table, and start inspecting, and have a huge team. And I was and I did that training at Brooke Army Medical Center, where they put us on rotations as part of one of those teams. They figured best thing to get ready for combat is see a trauma room in San Antonio on a Saturday night. So there's actually 2 different definitions there. So the one is that medical definition where it's an injury, it's a wound to living tissue caused by an extrinsic agent. That's what you're going to have in that trauma room at the hospital, at a trauma center. And there's different levels of trauma center hospitals. The other is a disordered psychic or behavioral state resulting from severe mental or emotional stress of physical injury. So that's the emotional state of that extreme state. Here's American Psychological Association. Trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event, like an accident, rape, or a natural disaster. Immediately after the event, shock and denial are typical. Longer-term reactions include unpredictable emotions, flashbacks, strained relationships, physical symptoms like headaches or nausea. These feelings are normal. That's what we really have to get at in trauma. We're having all these conflicting symptoms. But again, one of the key things that we have to do is normalize it and see these are the normal reactions of the human body to tremendous stress. We use the term trauma-informed care, and that's especially applied in a mental health or a medical situation, but pastoral ministry, chaplaincy, I think it's a useful term too, because understanding that trauma affects people differently. Trauma can be a single event, or it can be an ongoing thing. I think of my life has just been constant trauma with 2 kids with these kind of chaotic crisis births, both having significant long-term. My daughter was having surgeries until she was 6th grade. My son was, we noticed immediately, shortcomings and deficiencies and delays in just about every area. And so no, he turns 30 next week, or Saturday. And we've lived under that constant stress for 30 years. Looking at the history of somebody may react differently to one stress now, like a rape. And you get the history and you find out, like this is true of one of my soldiers, I had 12 rapes in one of my subordinate battalions on deployment. Started finding out about them 6 months later. And one young woman found out that she had had like 4 prior sexual assaults, starting when she was a young girl. And so these military ones are just, not only there's the trauma of that event and how the command is, and then them talking that maybe the guy'd be getting out of Leavenworth after only a year and a half, but it's also resurfacing all those prior injuries, all those prior emotions. How many conflicts that we have in the church. Think of that pastor that I mentioned who was so legalistic. How much of that was due to the trauma he experienced as a medic on D-Day? Trauma shapes us and makes us susceptible to re-wounding. And it changes who we are, how we approach. Think of how many cultures have been, their history has been just so much trauma and war and conflict. And how have whole cultures been shaped? How has the American psyche been twisted since 9/11 through a desire for revenge and anger? Got us to excuse torture, putting people in prison for 30 years and 20 years without trial, not realizing that all we're doing is stoking the fires for more anger and anger. So trauma-informed care is a lens looking at the human case, looking at how trauma affects the whole person, and looking how even presenting issues are going to be affected by earlier traumas in the life. Disasters, child abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, any of these things. Some traumas may clearly display criteria associated with PTSD, but others are more resilient. So different people have greater resilience. And they might handle some stressful situations differently than somebody else. Somebody might have what they call subclinical. You're having post-traumatic stress, but it's not meeting the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, but it's still affecting you, but maybe you recover sooner. So it's a whole lens, again, of looking at all of life through how these things affect us. It affects our ability to function. It can shake our belief system. How many of you read Elie Wiesel's book, Night? He was a young Jewish kid, became a professor at Boston University of Jewish theology, but he was in Auschwitz as a young kid. And he has this haunting thing of the night that they arrived in camp and the smokestack, smoke is billowing in and he's seeing these sparks and he's smelling the smell, and he talks about how it robbed him of his faith in God forever. Changes our worldview. We may be open and positive, but hurricane comes in, tornado takes out your house, not that house. Murderer kills your mom, rapist kills your daughter. These things affect how we view the world and other people and our sense of trust and our sense of safety. Dr. Norman Wright, trauma is a thief. It steals from people. It takes away their sense of well-being, security, predictability, and safety. It affects the whole person. Physically, cognitively, emotionally, spiritually. As a young chaplain on the neurosurgery and neurology ward at Walter Reed, this is what I was noticing, that even one guy was in an ultralight in Germany and he crashed, and he was not physically hurt, had a concussion. But one day he's talking to me because he's in such stress and frustration and confusion because he can tell that the staff are laughing at him behind his back. Because he's saying words pop up in the wrong order. He talks strange things. You know, his whole wiring is like messed up, and they think it's so funny. And me as this 24-year-old second lieutenant, I'm confronting these captains and majors in the interdisciplinary meeting, saying, you know, this is how he's seeing you guys and what you're saying. And, you know, they get defensive. Well, you know, we have this black humor. It's how we cope with it. I said, yeah, I understand that. I'm just letting you know this is what he's seeing from it. Now, if you ever see the movie MASH, now the movie is better than, and also bawdier in some areas, but it was written, the book was written by a combat surgeon in the Korean War about his deployment and the things that he saw. And I compare it with that DVD that I mentioned, the documentary, Baghdad ER. And yeah, it's the same thing. How are people, they're trying to heal, trying to help, but how's all that affecting their relationships with one another? How's the chaplain trying to minister? And there's two chaplains in the book. There's Father Mulcahy, who in the book is an older, wizened Maryknoll missioner who's been in the mountains of Bolivia for the previous 30 years, and he's hanging out with the guys in the swamp because he's catching up on sports and books and shows, and he just loves hanging out with those guys and smoking a cigar and having a drink. So he's one of the guys. And then there's a Protestant chaplain, Shakin' Sammy, who's just a goofball who's lying to people about how they're getting better, writing lying letters home, and they crucified him and sent him running out of town. Literally crucified him. But you know, it's meant to be kind of morbid humor, but it's written by a surgeon about his own experiences of how he got through a hellacious year in the Korean War. Other things, you know, the personality changes that I saw in patients with head injuries, the hopelessness, the changed relationships, how that one injury then starts affecting the whole family dynamic, the whole family system, the emotional responses, and probably in the spiritual, and I think the overall word is grief. Because somebody who has a loved one or somebody themselves, they've lost that person that they loved. They've lost that part of them that they recognized. So Ivan's going to talk specifically about grief tomorrow morning. What's the chaplain's role? And a couple of these slides are from my trauma class the Army had. How do we help the family and those affected use their own theology to find strength and meaning and purpose? Raise questions. Can we identify God's presence In the Dominican and the Franciscan traditions in Catholicism, preaching is referred to as naming grace. It's not that we're putting God into a position where he wasn't, but that we're naming and identifying where he is in the chaos and murkiness of life. Affirming their faith. And the religious support that's necessary at times, sacraments, ordinances, prayer, spiritual direction, those pastoral things that in a hospital setting, a trauma team, we're part of a team. Everybody knows their role. We're all gowned and masked. They taught us to make a cross on our gown because you got the big protective mask. And we had a place to stand while they were doing their work. And as soon as then they start packing the patient up to send them to x-ray after the immediate crisis, then we can shift over to the head of the patient, start directing pastoral care to them, doing an intervention, doing a prayer. But everybody knows it's this dance in that trauma room of everybody knowing their role, knowing what their part is, and the nurse who's registering everybody's attendance. Okay, chaplain's here. Good. We're good to go. So knowing our place and that we do have a unique role to play in these situations. Lots of other people providing support, but as pastors, we have that spiritual role to be that calm center of the hurricane, to be that spiritual focus, to be that reminder that God is still there in the midst of the darkness of Calvary. PTSD we talk about a lot, especially in the 80s we started hearing more about that. And how many different movies have you seen that give some kind of a perspective of PTSD? Rambo, First Blood was one of the first ones trying to depict the Vietnam vet as twisted and angry and affected by PTSD. Born on the 4th of July. See somebody who's experienced trauma and now also dealing with PTSD and finding meaning. But one of the first ones was All Quiet on the Western Front, this German novel of World War I, and it was made into a first movie like in the 30s. And that's the one that I resonate with, where the young guy comes back, he's on leave, he gets to go home to his village, and all the old men want him to talk about war and tell him about the fighting on the front and what the Kaiser should be doing, what the general should be doing. And he's just feeling just the walls close in around him because these old men at the bar have no clue what they're talking about. And the loneliness of his experience and the sense that there is nobody here who gets it makes him eager to get back to the battlefield. Hacksaw Ridge. For the first time, we got a glimpse of the fact that Desmond's father was a World War I vet with what we'd call PTSD. There's a lot of artistic license in how it told the story, but that was the first one to unveil that. Desmond's cousin, I saw her, she heard me preach and mention that once in California, and she said, he wasn't like that, the dad wasn't. He was the elder of the church by the time this came up. That was all in his past. But we haven't talked openly about Desmond's PTSD. And we probably won't for a while. But he too did it because it's a natural response to an unnatural situation. Here's some faces, real life faces of PTSD. Francis of Assisi. Now he was a combat veteran. He went into battle when Assisi was at war with Perugia, the next town across the valley. His dad was a wealthy merchant, the new middle class, and outfitted him with the best of armor. And he ends up getting captured, and he spends a couple of years as a prisoner of war in a dungeon before he's ransomed. And he comes back, and he starts living this new life, and he's got this commitment to peace and to taking care of the poor. And who does he gather around him but other military veterans who are also looking for a new life? And people at the time wrote about that and talked about this group as a group of wounded veterans who are now doing penance. Ignatius of Loyola, combat veteran, legs shattered by a cannonball. And it's while he was convalescing that he had a spiritual conversion and started getting his ideas for what became the spiritual exercises in the Jesuit tradition. It was his way to reflect on and refocus on Christ and Christ's role in his life after this shattering experience. Anybody know this guy? Any guesses? He was old in this picture. Taken, I think, in the 70s. Paul Tillich, one of the leading Protestant theologians of the 20th century. He was an army chaplain. World War I, artillery unit. His life was shattered. He came back with a totally different perspective of God. His view of God as the powerful God on the throne who's answering prayers like Santa Claus giving out presents was shattered. His personality was changed. His acting out sexually that his wife talked about after his death and wrote a book about, how messed up he was. And some of us can read that and see the scars of his wartime PTSD. This is a buddy of mine, Dave Peters. He went to war as a young fundamentalist chaplain, had a horrific combat tour in Iraq, came back to find that the major next door had been sleeping with his wife. He ended up going to Walter Reed to do a year of CPE, and then they made him one of the staff chaplains when my boss was doing CPE there, so they got to know each other. And in that time, he flipped out. He wrote a book called Death Letters to God, a death letter being the letter that you write to be given to your loved one after you die in combat. And he wrote of, just a very raw confession of, and his church ended up stripping of his endorsement as a chaplain because he got divorced. Didn't matter that his wife was the guilty one. We don't allow divorced chaplains. He became an Episcopal priest. But he wrote about his battles with alcohol, his hunger for companionship, acting out sexually in every other way. And then after he got his life back together, he wrote a book called Post-Traumatic God, how the church can minister to people who have suffered trauma. How did he put his theology back together in telling the stories of some of these other combat veterans? And he's now director of the Episcopal Veterans Fellowship. And we had him as a speaker for our Adventist Army Chaplains conference last November. I've mentioned Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, commander of the UN peacekeeping mission in Rwanda, 93 to 94, and his latest book I'm reading now, Waiting for First Light, My Ongoing Battle with PTSD. And he's in a hopeless situation because he's getting all this intelligence of what's happening. He's being told where the machetes and other weapons are stored. He's writing back to UN headquarters and saying, can I go and seize these weapons? No, you can't. Everything that he's asking to do to intervene, he's told, no, you can't. You got to stay there. And again and again. And he gets there without any funding, without any food for his soldiers, without any supplies. And the other units under him from Ghana and other places came with even less. And he had to be that witness to these atrocities up close. And that feeling of anger and helplessness that his hands were tied. And he did what he could to provide some safety where he could and save as many lives as he could. And then he comes back, and it's like within a couple of days of getting back, report to headquarters in Quebec, and you should be glad to be back to normal, and here we'll give him this office job. But he still runs at this frenetic pace. And then he has this need to tell his story. and he's accepting more speaking appointments because he's angry. He wants to do a report for the UN on what happened, and they don't care. They don't want it. He wants to hear Boutros Ghali had no interest in hearing of his experience. Nobody at the UN cared. He comes back, the Canadian military was in a shambles from so many peacekeeping missions. He ended up getting a personnel job, one of the head of the personnel department, and he was able to make a lot of changes based on his own felt needs, but multiple suicide attempts along the way that he has spoken openly about. And then they made a documentary. He wrote a book, Shake Hands with the Devil, about his experience in Rwanda, and then they did a documentary. 10 years later, he went back to Rwanda. And I watched that on YouTube last night. I got about halfway through. But he's one of, for Canada, he's the best known face of what PTSD and war trauma is like. And when he went out and started talking about his experience, all these young soldiers who finally felt the permission to talk about it. You know, so many of them could understand getting PTSD in a combat mission where people are shooting at you, but to get it from a peacekeeping mission, where you're forced to just sit there with your hands in your pockets and not do anything while you're seeing evil happening all around you. Defining PTSD: exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation, where the individual can directly experience the traumatic event, can witness it in person, as Dallaire did, or you can learn that the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or close friend, or experiences firsthand repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic event. So all of these things can create the same symptoms. Disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social interactions, capacity to work, or other important areas of functioning, and it's not the physiological result of another medical condition, medication, drugs, or alcohol. And you can look at Google PTSD or DSM-5, and it'll give you the diagnostic criteria. It'll say here there's these like 8 different categories, and if you have one of these symptoms in each category, you can be diagnosed with it. There are some symptoms of it where you're re-experiencing the traumatic event, either through memories, dreams, flashbacks. You can have symptoms of avoidance. You want to stay away from those places, events, or things that remind you of it. You feel numb. Maybe sometimes you can't remember the event. Or things that remind you of it, smells, sights, little things. They have this therapy at Brooke Army Medical Center called CAREN, Computer Assisted Rehabilitation Environment. And it's a sphere that you're in, and it's got a moving platform in so that the person can walk on different surfaces, and they often have an amputated leg and a prosthesis, and they're trying to learn to walk on different surfaces while you're also having projected on the screens all different stimuli. So the final exam is where the person has to be like they're in a boat and they're rocking back and forth to steer this boat through buoys in a storm at sea. But there's one where they're also just walking through a town. Somebody runs across the street carrying a box. Somebody pulls out a cell phone and is talking in it. Things that can trigger those PTSD reactions because of that package could have been an IED. That cell phone could have been somebody triggering an IED. So it's meant to help somebody respond to ordinary life, that you're going to be seeing some of these triggers and you can't help avoid it. So how can we learn to deal with it? Hyperarousal, easily started. Do not ever go up to a veteran behind them and touch them on the back. Do not. You might be on the ground. Feeling on edge, having difficulty sleeping, angry outbursts, always sitting so that you're facing the door, always scouting out where the escape routes are. Any of us that have deployed do that. It is just second nature. But we can't think of PTSD just as one thing. But this stress from combats, from high tempo operations, is a spectrum of things. You know, green, we're well repaired. Yellow, we're getting some mild stress. Orange, it's more serious. Red is where it's debilitating. So all of us who go to combat, all of us who go to any of these major disasters, we're all involved in these hyper-stressful situations. My unit, when we came back, nobody was shooting at us, but we were jacked up here getting ready to invade Syria, do attack missions with our helicopters, and then Putin and Obama came to an agreement, and we were ready to go. Our helicopters were moving that way. Our material was on the ships heading up to the port of Aqaba. And then, I mean, my guys were ready for battle, talking to me about it, getting prepped, and then with like a day to go, we jerked back. We were practicing embassy evacuations and planning that. And my piece is, what do we do with the people that we bring back from the embassy? How are we doing critical incident stress with them? What kind of support services do we have for them? And my pilots, as they're thinking about landing their helicopters at the embassy, they're all having these images of the fall of Saigon and the helicopters landing on the US Embassy. And my guys are saying, now we know how those Vietnam vets felt. And it was like, oh, we might go. No, let's go back. It's up and down, back and forth, all of us at this high level of readiness for 9 months. While also patrolling the northern Gulf, also keeping our eye on the Iranians, aware of my pilots taking pictures of the fishing boats with their machine guns on it and whatever, and then playing games with us, all the stuff that they did. And my guys said coming back from that deployment was harder than any of the ones they'd been on where they were actually shooting, because of the level of constant stress we were under. So it's that spectrum of responses. And how do we deal with it? This is the role of critical incident stress management. It's a training that's meant to, how can we help individuals process this trauma starting at the point of the trauma, feeling that if we get them sooner to start getting intervention sooner, closer to the event, it'll help them cope with it long term better. And I'm not going to get into this a whole lot, but these are trainings done by the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. We offer these trainings through Adventist Community Services. Marty Feldbush, former director of ACM, does these trainings for Adventist Community Services. And if you want to be certified as a disaster chaplain so that ACS can call upon you, or the Red Cross can call upon you.
Yeah, I got mine.
You got yours. You do these, and there's also some, for the U.S. we have FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Association. They have a lot of trainings on, so that you know the structure, the language, and the picture of the whole response that's coming. That's what gives you the certification so that you can be one of those who will be called. That's why I got called to Santa Fe, because I had done this. And they offer a lot of different courses on individual and group crisis intervention, suicide prevention, psychological first aid, workplace violence, managing school crisis. And this is the standard that firefighters are taught, police officers are taught. So after an officer shooting, they're going to want to do this with the police officer. After a fire in which a firefighter or civilians die, they're going to do this. At Santa Fe, teams were doing this with all the first responders, while we were focusing with the kids and their parents. Basic process is early on, like the day while it's still happening, you have this crisis management brief, which is just to get information out to people about what's there. Then after a few days, even 10 days or so, you'll do what's called a crisis intervention debrief, or critical incident debriefing, where you have those who are close to it go through a very emotional process, taking them down and up, where you get to have people who observed an incident share their own perspective. Somebody thinks, oh, I froze. I didn't do anything. Somebody else can tell them, no, you pulled 3 people out. Yeah, you were amazing. You did this and the other thing. And it's like, really? I didn't know I did that. And it can help them give that perspective and get out of just their own feeling of guilt and inadequacy for what they think they did or didn't do. And they hear from other people there that, no, they witnessed something totally different. And then start naming the emotional states and the physical responses. And then together with individual and long-term group therapy, we're hoping these are things that can help decrease the incidence of post-traumatic stress disorder by this early intervention and early psychological first aid. Any questions about any of this so far? I dumped an awful lot at you.
Would that be something we could do in our conference? Maybe we could...
Yeah, and I'd say contact Adventist Community Services, tell them you'd like to have Marty come up. And to do both the individual and group crisis intervention, that's a 3-day course. And it's really, as I said, that's a thing that you can use not after this, but you can also do that after a suicide or any crisis.
We did that at the Ontario conference.
Mm-hmm. Right. And these are things that are not taught in seminary, but I think are useful things for any pastor to know, especially in this day. Whether it's tornadoes, whether it's floods, whether it's shooting, vehicle accident, any of the traumas that we could face, these things are what give you the pastoral skills so that you know what to do. How many of you have had CISM training? Just one? Critical incidents are here to find any of these things, and I kind of went over them. And they use the term critical incident stress or post-traumatic stress, referring to this continuum of stress from the incident that might not necessarily be the disorder, but it's all of the stress of this situation. And critical incident stress is a normal response of normal people to an abnormal event. How many often in our ministry do we have this stress and we start beating ourselves up because how we're reacting after something? And it's affecting our whole person. I was in one stressful situation, one workplace. I noticed a rash, little bubbles all breaking out, all between my fingers and whatever. I went to the doc and said, "Are you under any stress?" No. I look at my current life, and I started noticing some symptoms I was having from eating on the road, traveling all the time. And I thought maybe I better go see the doc, especially I noticed my vision blurring. I said, well, this is weird. I just got glasses. Then I noticed myself getting up to pee 5 times in the night. And I say, okay, this is not normal. I started Googling. I said, oh, shoot, I better get to the doc. Had a 550 glucose level when I went to the VA. And doc was supposed to go home at noon. He stayed till 5 to make sure I got my eye exams and got some insulin in each arm. And because you get to 600 and you have a 25% chance of coma at that point. And I'd lost 25 pounds without noticing it. It was another little symptom. And I look at my colleagues at NAD or GC and how many start putting on the pounds after getting the jobs because of eating in restaurants all the time and traveling all the time and dealing with the level of issues that we have to deal with. And our body does not like to do this. And if we put our health message into practice, it should know that all the things that we do, stress affects the body. So what are we doing as Adventist pastors to live the health message? We'll come back to that. Oh, what do you know? Self-care right there. So this is the same slide before. All the stuff that you're telling others is happening to you when you're caring. In a crisis situation, we have to take those breaks. and take our distance. When they had the Oklahoma City bombing, 2 chaplains responded to that, and one of the Army chaplains that was there came and taught my class, one of my Army classes. And he noticed they were on 12-hour shifts. And they were inside the building, inside that wreckage for 12 hours, responding and pulling out bodies and taking care of the first responders. And then his shift ended, he goes to the break room, and what does he start doing? Ministering to all the people in the break room. 12 hours later, he's not slept. He goes back into the building on his shift. 12 hours later, he goes back to the break room, still ministering. He went like 3 days without any sleep. And then he found out that his colleague on the alternate shift was doing the exact same thing. So Ivan talked about boundaries. You know, those times when you really want to go into the office, and there's sometimes we have to go in for the crisis and the death. As pastors, we are the responder for our church members. But it's also knowing when to say, okay, when do I have to go home and sleep? When do I need to just leave the hospital and go walk around the block? When do I need to take care of myself? In the days and weeks following, take the time off, get away. All those things that we talk about in the New START acronym: nutrition, exercise, water, sunshine, temperance, rest, air, trust in God, are all the things we need to be doing now to keep healthy and to build up our resilience. But especially in the wake of crisis, we need to be making sure that we're doing those things so that we can continue to minister at that time and afterwards. And have somebody to talk to. And I found both chaplains and mental health counselors, in their own way, useful people for the stuff that I have to carry. Is that a true statement? Ministry is not all roses and sunshine. Think back to the crises you had early in ministry. Whether it's church conflicts or tragedy or illness. I had a church member who had been in Auschwitz as a young girl, had cancer, could feel the tumors break out in her body, and wished that she had died in Auschwitz. Wow, they didn't tell me about that one. What do you do when you have those things that you realize you're staring into that darkness? It's like, well, they didn't prepare me for this. My chain marking Bible study does not have a link on what to do or say to this person. Think of Noah after the flood. What did Noah do after the flood? He what? He got drunk. He fell flat drunk, and something's going on weird that biblical scholars who've written commentaries on Genesis, nobody's exactly sure what that's all about, of him laying naked and then walking backwards to cover it up. And then he comes out of his drunken stupor shouting and cussing and screaming, and that's where the Bible story leaves Noah. Until we get to Hebrews and find out what a great man of faith he was. I preached on that once and had people, I got a nasty anonymous note. You robbed me of my image of Noah, all my cute little Noah figurines. I'm now not going to be able to look at it in the same way. King David.
King David.
Man, what a guy who's riding up and crashing down and acting out and, grabbing his general's wife and killing him and keep her. And yet in the midst of it, what does God say about David? Man after God's own heart. This wounded, broken, crying, screaming, dancing around naked guy. Elijah. And he's up there on Mount Carmel calling fire down from heaven, seeing the glory of God on display. And the next minute, I'm scared, running off into the desert, worried what Jezebel and Ahab are going to do. And what does God do? He says, what does God say he needs in the middle of crisis? eat, sleep. Get away from people. Oh, Jonah in the storm. Yeah. These people, God, you're asking me to do the impossible. I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to take that call to northern Manitoba. I'm going to go to Southern Union where it's sunny. Shouting and screaming, and then goes and preaches hellfire and brimstone, and God decides to have mercy and save people. God, who's going to pay attention to me as a preacher now? I promised hellfire and brimstone, and you let people go. Peter on the sea. This impetuous guy who's always determined to show God that he knows what's best, and he's the leader of the pack. And he's sinking beneath the waves. I was at a prayer breakfast a couple weeks ago, military prayer breakfast, and we had it at, it was Armed Forces Day, we had it at Dallas Baptist University. And in front of the administration building is a bronze sculpture of Jesus washing the feet of Peter on what leadership is about. And I caught a picture of one of the generals taking a picture of that statue as a way to remind him. I had a conference call with one of our generals last night, and he wants to have a conference call with all the chaplains every month to say what's on his heart. He's the first commanding general over me. And also he says, you guys all have my cell phone. He says, I don't care what it is. You guys and the sergeants major have the right to call me directly anytime you think there's something that I need to know about. You guys can go over the chain of command, go around the chain of command. You are my eyes and ears. You are my special advisors. I'm enforcing this relationship with us because you're the ones who are taking care of my soldiers and their families. So don't be afraid. He says, better to text me, but don't be afraid to, because I want to hear from you. I need to know what you see. Ellen White. Oh, she was always a cheerful, happy soul, wasn't she? How many of you have read Life Sketches? Man, her growing up and the trauma of that head injury that she had and how sick she was for the longest time, but that all stopped when she had her first vision, right? 1859, oh, why is it that such gloom rests upon everything? Why can I not rise above this depression of spirit? I have no health and my mind is completely depressed. Somebody who saw the heavens opened and shouted, glory, 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 can not long after be talking like this. So can we name the dark places that our souls go at these times of tragedy? Here's 4 different terms that we should know and be able to know how they affect us. Burnout, compassion fatigue or secondary trauma stress, vicarious trauma, and moral injury. How many of you have heard the term moral injury before? That's a relatively new one, but more's being written about it, and I'll talk about that. So burnout, we think that term's been around forever, but it was only coined in 1974. A state of chronic work-related stress, especially in helping professions. So if it's not work-related, it is not burnout. It's something else. Burnout is a specific thing related to work that can lead to physical and emotional exhaustion, cynicism, detachment, feelings that you're ineffective and you haven't accomplished anything. Do pastors feel like that? And guess what? This was in the news today. that it's now a legitimate medical diagnosis. It's not in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but it is in the International Classification of Diseases from the World Health Organization. Doctors can diagnose someone with burnout if they meet the following symptoms: feelings of energy depletion or exhaustion, increased mental distance from one's job, or feeling of negativism or cynicism related to one's job, reduced professional efficacy. Same things, different words here. First, rule out adjustment disorder, rule out anxiety and mood disorders, and the diagnosis is limited to work environments and shouldn't be applied to other life situations. Does burnout happen to pastors?
Oh, yes.
Ministerial director, do you hear about this much? Do you see much of this? And the way we work ourselves, especially as we used to. I think some of our conferences are getting better. Some are much better than others. My father-in-law, I've looked at his notebooks. He was out doing Bible studies every night of the week. He had as many as 5, 6 churches. How Ivan did it with 20, man. In the mountains of Colombia. Mental distance. Yeah, there are times where you just don't want to go to that board meeting. You don't want to go to the hospital. You don't want to deal with that treasurer. You don't want to go to that workers' meeting. You don't want to hear from the conference secretary or the ministerial director. You just want to withdraw. I go to workers' meetings and I hear some guys that are talking more about sports or their stock investments and how they're doing than sharing about ministry with their colleagues. And it's like, I wonder, what's going on here? Then I see them in other jobs in the next call, and suddenly they're talking about ministry and what a joy it is, and they're not talking about stocks anymore. Putting 2 and 2 together here. Or the negativism or cynicism. Have you ever found yourself like that? Man, these people, this ministry, it's not worth it. This church is, In my first district, I had 2 churches, night and day. One was wonderful, the other was, and I had a predecessor, he couldn't keep his nose out of my business and kept coming around and hearing the gossip and spreading gossip. Oh, that made me negative and cynical. And as a result, if you're withdrawn, if you're negative, your efficiency is going to go down. But they started seeing this with nurses and doctors. Then they started seeing it in other helping professions especially. Different issue, compassion fatigue, that term first was coined in 1992, and then Figley in 1995 used the term secondary trauma stress. So you see these two complementary. And this is the result of somebody, whether it's a clinician, a chaplain, mental health provider, physician, nurse, caring for trauma victims. And you're mirroring the same PTSD symptoms. Even though you were not directly involved by the trauma, you're caring for somebody and you're taking on and developing the same PTSD symptoms. Re-experiencing the event. I've had 2 Humvee rollovers. Humvee is an armored vehicle, I mentioned. One guy in the turret is always going to get flattened. Had one where a young guy had just gotten out of basic training. He was 18 years old. His first annual training with the National Guard. They put him driving this vehicle that he did not have a license for. 3 NCOs in the car. It was after we had a tropical storm the night before, so the roads were wet and mucky and slimy and slippery. They didn't make him put a seatbelt on. These doors have things called combat locks to make sure the doors don't swing open when it rolls, and they didn't make him put the combat locks on. Didn't have his helmet secured right. He lost control, did a 360, rolled, that big armored 400-pound door opened. He kind of was flung out by the centrifugal force, and then that 400-pound door came back. And all the people in the convoy behind it saw it. and two of my subordinate chaplains were there within about 5 minutes. I went to the emergency room with the survivors. I had to go with the commander to see the family. And then after he did the investigation, I had to go with him to share the investigation results, and he's dealing with the fact that it was our fault. He's dealing that responsibility as a commander that his people did not do their job, and there was no point in this young kid dying. Do I re-experience those images? Oh yeah. Avoidance and numbing of event reminders after those suicides. That's why I took a break to went to the Army Reserve. I need to do with something radically different for a couple of years. Persistent state of arousal. Hypervigilance, sleep disorders, anger, concentration problems, startle response, physiological reactivity, all this stuff. And it can be chronic or acute. Long-term stress or that sudden trauma, it's doing all of this stuff to the caregiver as it is to the victim. Third issue, vicarious trauma. This term was just coined in 1990. And this is what's happening to you inside your brain as a result of dealing with somebody under stress. It's the transformation of the inner experience of the therapist that comes about as a result of empathic engagement with the client's trauma material. So how is your worldview changing as a result of hearing about all this bad stuff that happened to them? A process that's normative and inevitable. So how do we distinguish these things? With compassion fatigue, we're having symptoms that people can observe. With vicarious trauma, it's our inner world, how we view the world, our own feelings about trust, our own beliefs about the justice of the world. So do you get those distinctions that are happening there? The one is just the overload from work, from the burnout of constantly going. The other is us developing PTSD symptoms as a result of ministering with people who have it. And here is, how are we looking at the world now when we see what other people have gone through? My view on military justice after 12 of my soldiers were raped. And I was kept out of the loop of the response. And I wasn't even invited to the meetings to discuss it and see what was happening. So I came back 6 months after my deployment before I learned what all had happened to my soldiers. And what my subordinate chaplain did and failed to do that got them distrustful of their chaplain. So, thoughts or questions at this point of just the problems that we can get into?
How will all these things be translated into working policies?
Well, I think as we get at what are some of the responses to these things, then that can help inform what our policies are about personnel, about our health policies for people, how a ministerial director or conference secretary and president make allowances for both training of pastors and supporting of them. That's where it has the policy effect, I think, as we see, okay, how do we take care of pastors that this is going to happen to? So, the response to burnout, how can we turn each stress on each situation or symptom on its head? Instead of being exhausted, be aware that this is happening to you. Identify it and take care of yourself. In the midst of just Being emotionally numb, what are the things that you enjoy? Do you like going fishing? Going golfing? Go do something like that. Just say no to some of those work situations. Are you constantly going and going and going and going and you think you have to be at every single committee meeting? Say no. This is my family night. Mormons have their family home evening where they shut down everything and say, no, I'm with my family that Wednesday night. Can you carve out that time where you just say to people, no? I said no to things on Sabbath afternoon as a pastor. I'm not going to go for 15 hours on a Sabbath from Sabbath school, be the first person at church, stay there through church, through potluck, through sunshine bands in the afternoon, through AY, through Saturday evening socials, to youth basketball games at 10 o'clock. I'm not going to do that. That's one way for me to say no. Some of you might be killed if you say no. Can we find the time in the Sabbath to have a Sabbath for ourselves on the Sabbath? Exercise. How many of you are in the NAD plan where you're keeping steps and measuring your steps and doing all this proactive self-care stuff? A bunch of us are wearing Garmin's and so on, Fitbits, so that we can count our steps every day. Joe Kidder was doing something like 20,000 when I saw him a week ago that he does every day. Yeah, every break. He was out walking around the campus and taking others with him, and as his goal, 20,000 steps. Positivity, that positive outlook can make a difference. Can you change? Can you reorder? Can you get rid of some things? Can you have someone to share your burden with? Whether that's an Adventist pastor, whether that's a counselor, whether it's the Presbyterian pastor down the street, who do you have that you can share? What about elders? Can they take care of some of the reasons? Can they go do some of the things that you would normally go? Can we trust them to hand it over? If you have a multi-church district, you have to. Now, one thing I learned from having that first multi-church district where I crashed and burned, to then being a military supervisor and having multiple battalion chaplains, when I came back in 2009 to a multi-church district, I decided that I was going to treat each of those churches as a battalion and each of the head elders as a battalion chaplain. And that my job is primarily to support them and their ministry, not to be doing everything. Guess what? They felt affirmed. They felt happy that they were doing things. I focused on training them, being a pastor to them. Before board meetings, I'd have an elders meeting and we'd work through and hash out things and have a discussion so that all the elders could go into a board meeting with consensus on the right thing to do. That took the monkey off my back. That relieved my stress an awful lot. And when a new pastor came, it's like, now I'm the one they say, oh, Pastor Cork, we miss board meetings when you ran them and they were an hour long. Response for compassion fatigue. Realize that it will happen. That it's not something wrong with you when you're having these emotional states and these physical states. And so that's where the training on these things. Training people to realize that it's real and it's inevitable. If you know it's going to happen, and if you're trained that this is going to happen, when you start seeing the symptoms, you'll be able to say, oh, yeah, that's right. Chaplain Cork said this was going to happen to me at some time. And then how do we address those acute stress reactions? Critical incident stress management, mental health referral, and meeting our basic physical, psychological, and social needs. Vicarious trauma response, instead of managing the symptoms, how do we transform the pain we're going through? Do we love the work that we're doing and see it as meaningful? Self-care, again. Somebody asked me about escaping and detachment. How do you break away at the end of the day from the stuff? How do you? What do you do at home so that when you come home from the office or the hospital, you don't bring that into the home and it's sitting there in the middle of the dinner table? Anybody? What do you do so that your family is not bearing the brunt of your ministry during the day? Nobody's doing anything effective?
What I do is I try to live the moment with my family, to enjoy.
Okay.
I'm having dinner with them, then I want to know what they did, what good things happened. And intentionally, I try to be positive. Because I recognize that sometimes when we are not healthy, we tend to be, not only us, but also our wives and children can be negative.
Yeah.
And so practicing positivity works for me.
Okay. I like that.
My family is very small. It's just me and my son. So
Okay.
after work, you know, we have movie time.
Okay. One person I knew spoke of kind of in his imagination taking all that stuff of the day and then hanging it on the doorpost or the post of the stairs as he was coming up into his house and saying, okay, it's there, and going into the house, and then as he came out, picking it up and taking it to the office when he went the next day.
He left it on the other side of the house.
But do we seriously take those vacations? We have so much allotted vacation time, and are we taking those? And our administrators making sure that pastors take that vacation time and go away. I'm so glad that I get a spouse travel budget, and that there's times that I can take my wife to things. Now, there's some things she's very happy not to have to go to. She went to NAD year-end meetings once. She said, thank you, I don't need to go that again. She went to Germany and Switzerland last fall. We went to Cologne, stayed 2 doors from my daughter's room when she was there. My wife loved that. And when my boss said, how about doing that Germany retreat again this year? Take your wife, have fun. She did that. But I'm glad that they see that we're doing this all the time, and we're taking so much away from our families that there need to be times when we're bringing them along. Last year, as I said, ministerial office in ours going to Cape Hatteras, a couple of beach houses. Dave Gemmel has one there. So the ministerial folks were in one, we were in the other, and just walking out, not all meetings all day. It's another thing, ministerial workers meetings. One conference I was in, they started at 8 o'clock. They did not have any planned bathroom breaks. They figured just go out, is report after report after report after report. So I hope workers' meetings have potty breaks. How do we create meaning, infuse our current activity with meaning, challenge our negative beliefs and assumptions, participate in community building activities? That's for me where that ministerial group comes in, getting ideas, getting suggestions from others, doing something different in the community for me, as opposed to all the admin stuff I do for ACM. Proper supervision. Do you have somebody that really supervises you, that you can go to, who can be a work mentor? Senior pastors in the conference that you trust? Pastors in other conferences in the union that you might be able to reach out to, whoever. Who are those people that can model that balance and help you to make your personal life a priority? You're not there to be martyred for the sake of the gospel. Your family life matters to Jesus Christ. Your wife and children, husband for female, if they have them, whatever, whoever your family is, God cares about them. And that you have that role that He gave you first and foremost before your call to minister, to be the head of that family with your spouse. Questions? Stand up. Stand up. Stretch tall. And down. And up. And breathe deep. And down. And we're going to plug on for a few more minutes. Anybody know what the term moral injury is? You haven't heard it, can you guess?
Wrongfully gossiped about and the result of public defamation.
Well, good guess. Any other guesses? Character assassination? That's kind of what he's talking about. Not quite. Well, it's coined by VA psychiatrist, 1994, Jonathan Shea. He wrote a book called Achilles in Vietnam, Combat Trauma and the Undoing of Character. And he tells the story of, how many of you remember the story of Achilles? Did you read the Aeneid? Or the Iliad, rather. And, you know, they're going to Troy. Why are they going to Troy? Because, you know, Paris takes the beautiful woman and runs off, and they got to get her back, and they got to lay waste to Troy. And they call in all the warriors, and Achilles is the greatest. He's the one that's fighting single combat. And he's out there as the hero. Of course, this war goes on years and years and years and years and years, for 10 years. And Agamemnon, the king, he takes a look at one of Achilles' war prizes, this beautiful girl, and says, you know, you don't deserve her. I'm going to take it back. I'm going to take her for myself. Now imagine getting the Medal of Honor and then the president saying, oh, you know, that looks so nice on you. I think I'd do it better. I mean, it looks bigly better on me. I want to plate it in gold so it looks like the best, the beautiful, the most smartest, the best medal that anybody ever got. Can you imagine a leader doing that? And what does that then do to Achilles? He's angry. He's demoralized. He's wondering, what the heck did I come out on this for? I cannot respect this guy. Suddenly in all the staff meetings, he's just hurling abuse and contempt at the king. It was a more equal society, so it wasn't like he was going to get his head chopped off. But then, the change in character. Instead of being the one who's going to let prisoners go, he's torturing them and slaughtering them in his anger. Instead of being out there in front, leading the charge of the battle, he's sulking by his ship on the shore, throwing his armor aside, just sitting there in disgust, moaning and complaining about the futility of this stupid thing that he got sucked into doing. And what Shea noticed was a lot of Vietnam service members mirroring those same reactions during the war. How many of them plunged into alcohol and drugs? How many of them just got cynical towards the whole Johnson and Nixon administrations, came back, took part in protests, checked out, became cynical and despairing, didn't believe in the mission? That's what that book is about. So it's a betrayal of what's right by those people in authority above you. But then, 2009, Brett Litz, another VA psychiatrist, he took it from that view focused towards the leaders to the individual and the scars that happened from their breaking a moral code, them crossing a line, perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. So seeing that buddy rape a Vietnamese woman, seeing the soldiers in your platoon burning down civilian houses, yourself being told by your commander, shoot at that person on that bicycle and kill them, knowing that it's just a kid trying to get away. This now is one of the biggest issues that we face with our post-9/11 vets. After 18 years of a war that just won't stop, in which we see that the things that got us into it were lies. Reactions, kind of this Venn diagram, it got confused. For a long time, these were all things just seen as part of PTSD. But now we're kind of pulling them apart and saying there's a lot of similarity to both. Both the anger, depression, anxiety, insomnia, nightmares, self-medication, alcohol, and drugs, all of that stuff is shared by both. PTSD is more specifically those fear-based reactions. Startle, memory loss, fear flashbacks. Moral injury is especially the guilt, the grief, the shame, the regret, the alienation. I'm not worthy. God can't forgive me. Here's Shay. How does moral injury change someone? It deteriorates their character, their ideals, ambitions, and attachments begin to change and shrink. Both flavors of moral injury, and by this point he's accepted Litz's addition, both flavors of moral injury impair and sometimes destroy the capacity for trust. When social trust is destroyed, it's replaced by the settled expectancy of harm, exploitation, humiliation from others. With this expectation, there are a few options. Strike first, withdraw, and isolate oneself from others, like Achilles, or an Odysseus. Think of his experience. He comes back from war, and people are saying, well, where the heck have you been the past 10 years? Everybody else has been home all these years. And he starts telling these outlandish stories about dragons and sirens and cyclopses and monsters and all this stuff. The narrator never talks about any of those things as if they actually happened. Those things are only presented in the stories that Odysseus tells at banquets while drinking. So a psychologist looks at this and says, you know, here's the veteran who's just projecting all these fantasies as a way to cover up what really happened to him on deployment. Creating deceptions, distractions, false identities, and narratives to spoil the aim of what is expected. That was Shay's second book, was Odysseus in America. Treatments? Well, Brett Litz wrote this book, Adaptive Disclosure, in which patients are guided through a dialogue with a forgiving and compassionate moral authority about the transgression. Now, he's an atheist, he's a psychologist, but I read that and it sounds like somebody confessing their sins to a priest. That's what has to happen. You're bearing all these things about what you've done or failed to do, and you got to tell somebody who you respect as somebody who's compassionate and forgiving and who can represent a power that is forgiving and graceful. This is where the pastor has more of a role than the psychiatrist. As we listen, we need to listen. All that stuff we've been talking about today. What are we hearing? How do we restore the hero narrative instead of this person being seeing themselves as a victim? How do we turn it around so that they see the good that they were called to do and positive things they did do and can do? Forgiveness. How can people who are worn down with guilt and shame come to experience forgiveness? What can wash away my sins? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. Isn't that something we have to offer? How many of our church boards and stuff would be a difference if we were cultivating this forgiveness? Did any of you go to the Questions on Doctrine anniversary at the seminary in 2007? It was 50 years after the publication of the book Questions on Doctrine. And some of our young theologians and historians, like Julius Nahm, Mike Campbell, and others, said, you know, we've never had a time when these people who've been fighting for 50 years have actually come together to talk about these things. And they got this idea for a conference co-sponsored by Oakwood, Andrews, and Loma Linda to actually bring all these people together and talk. And certain of the brethren said, no, we can't do that. That's too risky. They've tried to put pressure on the institutions. No, don't back that. Don't support that. And the institution says, no, we're going to do it. We think this is necessary. And to hear these people talk, I had lunch one day with Dave Larson and with Colin and Russell Standish. And man, what a heartfelt conversation there was. And Colin and Russell, instead of being these fire-breathing heresy exterminators that they are on paper, were like two old grandpas. And in that setting, amazing things happened. And we concluded with communion. And I'm sitting with Denis Fortin in the pew when we see the people come out on the platform for communion. And Denis' jaw just dropped. He says, "Oh my goodness." Because who was at the communion table but Angel Rodriguez in the middle, George Knight on one side, and one of the Standish brothers on the other side. And these folks were at the foot washing, crying on each other's shoulders, washing each other's feet, hugging each other. And there was such an experience of peace and healing and grace in that moment. And so many people were afraid of it. But it was the single most powerful experience of grace that I've ever seen. Because some young people said, let's do it a different way than we've been doing it for 50 years. It's a journey. Healing from any of these things, healing from any of the shame that we bear as pastors, healing from any of the wounds that anybody has done to us in the course of our ministry or our childhood. It is a journey. Now, Odysseus shows back up at home, and he's unrecognizable. His face has changed. He's worn. He's broken. But then his old servant is washing his feet and recognizes a scar in his leg and says, "Odysseus, you're home." And at that point, the disguise falls away. No longer is he there to tell stories. He's there to reclaim his wife and defend his honor and retake his place as king. A lot of people do pilgrimages. A lot of these pilgrimages developed as a result of after war, after the Crusades. And our former seminary dean, Denis, he and his wife are on like day 35 of doing the Camino de Santiago. They started in France and walking for over a month, like 6 weeks or some odd things, all the way across northern Spain to end up, not that they're practicing Catholic theology, doing it as historians, as the encounters of the people along the way. One group started a 22 with 22 for the 22, doing a 22-kilometer hike with 22 kilograms on your backpack in honor of the 22 veterans a day who suicide. The Vietnam Wall in D.C. was Vietnam vets, when they saw the design by this Asian architect who was hardly born during Vietnam, they saw it as an insult, as a gash. But once they started going there and seeing their faces reflected in that black granite with the names of their friends that they left behind, that has become one of the most emotional pilgrimage sites for veterans. Saving Private Ryan. At the end, he goes to the grave, and he was told, "Earn this," Tom Hanks' character said to him. And he takes his family there to the captain's grave and said, "Did I earn it? Did I do a good enough job?" And that's when all of his kids and grandkids surround him. And Zacchaeus, what did he do when he was welcomed by Christ? I got to give back. I got to restore. I got to do this. I got to throw a party. You ever see the movie The Mission? Robert De Niro's character plays this slaver who's converted, but he has this burden of his guilt and his shame for slavery. And as they go up above the falls to see the Indians, the Guarani, he carries all of his armor. And they cut it away from him. And those Indians forgive him. And he falls into their arms, and they're hugging and crying and cheering. And where he finally was able to experience that grace. And now we have Vietnam vets going to Vietnam. Trying to meet the people that were on the other side of the battlefield, or at least finding some of their family members, going to those places to find that same kind of reconciliation and grace. What's the role that the church can play, that we pastors should be able to play for our fellow pastors? Sense of community, grace, forgiveness, healing, and rekindling of that vision for mission. So many of our young veterans, what they do, we have this thing called the Combined Arms Center in Houston. It's near downtown, and it's like 30 veteran service organizations in one building in a young adult populous area of town. And we got all kinds, they can come in, get assessed, find out, do you need work issues, mental health support? Do you just want to give back to the community? We have things like Team Red, White, and Blue that's involved in just doing running events together. We have Team Rubicon that does disaster response. We have Mission Continues that does service projects in the communities. All ways for veterans to get a sense that I have a mission in life. I have a way to give back to the community. How can I heal where I once destroyed? And that's just grown in the last couple of years, and now being modeled by other cities, and we in turn were modeled by some of the founders of it, went to places like the Netherlands and saw similar programs for vets and said, this is what we need. And hope. What do we as caregivers need to be able to give? What do we need to be able to give our fellow pastors? Acceptance, non-judgmental, patience, understanding in that relationship. My second church, I followed a guy who sexually assaulted a 15-year-old girl in the church. Nobody in the church knew about it. The leadership, this was a Lutheran church, and the bishop told me ahead of time what I was going to be dealing with, and a couple of the key leaders knew about it, so we talked about it. I mentioned it as I was dealing with it, wondering what to do, and I'm ministering to the family. And the girl had found a lot of healing. It happened at a church camp outside of state. He took her along with his family and assaulted her while his wife and kids were off playing somewhere else. She told her school counselor. The legal authorities were brought in that other state, so it was never told in Vermont where we were. But then she went around with her school counselor, going around to all these other schools, telling about how she overcame this thing. So all these people in the public world are finding out she's going to the state Masonic convention, telling her story, and the church is not dealing with it. So as I was wrestling with how to handle it as a pastor, I told it at our clergy group. And one of my friends, Phil, he told me later, he says, you didn't notice what happened at that point. Nobody else wanted to hear it. He says, they all pulled back, they all crossed their arms, they all physically separated themselves from you, even in subtle ways. Because I was shocking them with news about a colleague that they had trusted. Nobody had told them either. He says, I made it a point to lean forward, to come over to you and put my arm around you. He says, I knew you needed me. And to this day, he's my closest pastor friend. Because he was the only one that got it. That's what he was able to offer me at that time. We are to be ministers of hope. And again, this text, praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion, the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. One of the things that we're doing at the Army is, what are the Adventist resources that we can bring to bear? So we got the creation health materials from Florida Hospital, took that to the Chief of Chaplain's office, I had so many colonels say, wow, that stuff looks really cool. But what is it? It's the same New Start stuff. It's the same principles from Ministry of Healing, just different words, all saying, this is what we need to be living a healthy life now. This is what we need to be living so that we can endure those battles that will come to us. This is what we need to be doing so that we can heal from those scars. And how can we encourage each other in this? Hockey game tonight at 8, right? Oh, no ice, right? And those boundaries. We talked about those. Boundaries being a hard one at 4:30, the close of the day.
No.
But I hope this was some helpful stuff.
Circle of Hope Network, doing life and being church together.